risk factor for adolescents and them managing and dealing with mental illness. So when we think about risk factors, again, there are also protective factors. And kind of mentioned some of those earlier, but having a supportive family environment and social networks, whether that is, and that family environment doesn't have to be a normal family environment or quote unquote normal family environment. It may be I'm being raised by my sister or I'm being raised, but it's a solid, consistent, and stable family environment. It makes a big difference. I'm in a social network. I'm in the step team at school. I'm consistently engaging with this group of positive individuals. Church can play a big role here when it's addressing those things. Concrete support for basic needs. Not having your basic needs met, not only being homeless, not sure if I'm going to eat. That can be a risk factor, but it can also be a family protective factor where I know I'm getting my basic needs met. Stable peer relationships. Peer relationships for adolescents is a major factor where I have consistent, because adolescents who don't have positive, consistent peer relationships are often those who isolate, those who deal more frequently with depression because of that, and anxiety. So having those peer relationships that are positive and add to their life is a major protective factor. Parental education, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the parent has to have a master's degree or PhD, but just parental education around mental health, around stress management, around anger management. Those kind of things can really be a protective factors for addressing adolescents' needs. Again, I brought up access to healthcare and social services, which is a good factor. It may be that an adolescent doesn't want to talk to their family members or to a church member. So it's really important that they have access to appropriate services, consistent services that meet their needs. Okay, caring adults, role models, not necessarily professional supports, but some natural supports, where it may be a mentor or maybe just an older person that's a family friend that is safe and that I feel that person feel comfortable with, makes a big difference. And also just community protective factors. What things are in the community that are beneficial to adolescents? How can they feel like, one, they're getting their needs met? The needs are being met, they're being heard, which is a big factor for adolescents. They're developing fulfilling relationships. They're being in situations where they have to adapt to change. They're able to use adaptive coping mechanisms. They're in situations where they start to realize their potential. A major issue with adolescents is a hopelessness, a sense of hopelessness. If we look at our society, we look at our communities, many of our adolescents feel hopeless. And that hopelessness can be put on by negative attitudes. Sometimes it can be generational. Sometimes it can be socially learned. If mom has always talked negative and dad has always been negative, then that can be a socially learned behavior. So those are things that we have to, as parents, we have to also put in check. So that goes back to a risk factor. Is it a generational, is it a biological thing? So if a parent is dealing with mental illness, it's very important for them to address that mental illness, because some of those behaviors, which may be associated with your mental illness, can be socially learned by your children. Meaning, and we think about our own lives, how did I see mom cope? How did I see dad cope? If I was growing up in a home with a mom who was depressed or anxious, and when life events happen, she cut off everything, then that can be socially learned. So it's really important. That's why I say to get buy-in from the families when you're dealing with adolescents, because sometimes not only will the services and the engagement in mental health treatment or supports be beneficial for the adolescent, having that family member address their issues and concerns makes a better chance for that child having more stability, that adolescent seeing change. So we often take on the things of our burdens of our parents. We often take on the behaviors of our parents. Just personally, I think about some of the things that I do in my own life. I know I do because I watched my mom do growing up. I put bleach in my dishwater because I watched my mom doing that growing up. Certain things, I don't wash my hands in the kitchen sink because I watched my mom doing that growing up. Also, when I turn it to coping, when I'm overwhelmed, I pray. I saw my mom doing that growing up. So if I'm in a home where there may be the opposite, my mom stays in bed all day. When I'm overwhelmed, I stayed in bed all day. So people, that happens. So that's a big factor that, sorry, there's a lot of motorcycles outside. So sorry, can you all hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Okay. This is fine.
There's a lot of adolescents who don't have positive image, haven't learned how to cope because they haven't seen people coping effectively. So learning how to cope effectively and getting their needs met in an appropriate way helps them to develop skills and navigate different environments where they don't feel overwhelmed, where they don't feel like they are pressured to fit into whatever category society, peers, or anyone else wants them to fit into, and getting to develop a positive self-identity, which helps them, as emotionally, which helps them developmentally, where they can function in a better way because I know who I am, I'm self-aware. And self-awareness for adolescents is an awesome thing. I've learned in individual therapy with adolescents that when they become self-aware, when they identify what it is, what's the trigger, why am I upset, why am I emotional, they deal with it better. So giving them their own power to have education on mental health. What am I feeling? Why am I feeling this way? What factors are contributing to this? And as they start to develop internal and external coping mechanisms, they'll begin to use them more so and be aware of their surroundings and their environment and have a little bit more self-control in certain settings. So it's really education for parents and the adolescents yourself is a really good protective factor and prevention factor for one, because if a lot of parents were educated, as parents become more educated, they can identify some of the risk factors and kind of start to address those things, whether it's them engaging with their child, them identifying a counselor or a therapist to engage with their child, a mentor to engage with their child. It's just good education for the whole family nucleus, the whole family unit. Grandma needs to be educated on mental health. Some of the things that we did then, we can't do now. Some of the things that we said to children, and we may have not identified that it is impact, we can't say now. So we have to really work on educating everyone in the family unit so that we can address adolescents mental health. A big factor is some of the generational norms, some of the cultural factors play a big role, depending on whether that is a cultural factor within that adolescent's family, community, because everything's different. We can't just say just in the Black community, because there's a Black community, there's a white community, but there's also those family units who do things differently. Go back to the example about me learning, socially learning in my family culture, we put bleach in dishwater. I have a friend who's also African American who was in disbelief that we put bleach in in dishwater. So even though we both are the African American culture, there's different things within each family culture in the way that people do things. So in adolescence, sometimes we forget that not only are they learning the culture of the community, the greater world, but they have their own family culture. So and a big one for the African American community, and within small nucleus communities, culturally, has been, we don't talk about our emotions. We don't deal with things. We don't address things. It's okay. Don't talk about it. So a lot of adolescents are walking around dealing with a lot of issues, a lot of stress, a lot of things that they aren't able to communicate, and they don't feel that they have a trusting situation to communicate those things. So when you are hopeless, alone, feel isolated, it's very likely that you're going to deal with stress and deal with things that cause anxiety, depression. And so again, a lot of things that we as a community have to start looking at is, how are we serving adolescents? How are we addressing adolescents? How are we empowering adolescents? And even beyond adolescents, even younger kids, allowing them to express their emotions, allowing them to start to identify their triggers, allowing them to talk about things. Just to shut up and be quiet and go in your room is not working now. That's not what is working. I think that is a big factor of why a lot of people in the African American community especially have been resilient with some of the things that they've been through. However, that resiliency doesn't minimize the trauma or the internal issues that have come about from their experience. So in a place now that we know more, we're getting more educated on certain things, we have to really support adolescents in a way that is open. We want them to be able to talk to us and communicate with us. And it's not to say that we won't hold them to a standard. The standard still needs to be there. However, we want to make an open conversation where they feel freely to engage about their feelings and what's going on. We need to make sure that they feel heard. That's a big factor for adolescents, often not feeling like they are heard and keeping things in. Although there are some adolescents who may need things a step further, there are some individuals with emotional disturbances, behavior disturbances that may need medication for some. And for some, that's going to be the way that they manage well and do well. But that comes again with education. I had a 12-year-old who was all F student. And so you have to deal with every aspect of the child. So this young lady had all Fs, very, very aggressive. After going to therapy, I identified that there was sexual trauma. So she started to deal with the sexual trauma. So some of the behavior went down, but the grades were still the same. So she got treated and started taking medication for ADHD. She's an all A student. She's doing well. Not to say that she's not, she still going to deal with the everyday stresses, but sometimes we have to look at the whole thing. One may say everything is connected just to the trauma, but there was also ADHD. Even though that could have impacted, the trauma can impact that, we have to address the whole person. And so in doing that, you can see a lot of changes and support. And again, that comes with consistency. Her identifying that sexual trauma may have not happened if she didn't have consistent relationship with a therapist who she was able to trust. So that is a big factor in adolescence, in dealing with adolescents and managing them. again, I always go to education because adolescents spend most of their time in schools, right? So teachers really need to be educated on trauma. Teachers need to be educated on the chronological developmental age, psychological age, right? Is a teenager that comes in your class and you're looking at her body frame and you're expecting her to have a certain standard or behave in a certain way. And she's not, because developmentally she's not there. Or you're looking at her chronological age and saying she should be this or he should be that. But then there's the developmental part. And then there's also a functional part where this person has had life experiences that they feel like they're more mature than you, right? And so here's this teacher coming in and identifying herself as an authority over me. I'm not taking that. I do everything in my house. I take care of my sisters and brothers. I do the laundry. I'm grown. So all those factors and being educated on the experience of the population that you're working with, adolescents, is really important. So from the household is a collective, taking it back to even when we say it takes a village to raise a child, that village needs to not only be within the family nucleus, but it needs to be community members, church members, teachers, everybody that has some kind of engagement or involvement with children, police officers. In some communities where the police officers have those relationships, you'll see that there's less decreased violence. There's decreased issues with teenagers because I'm able to talk to Officer Jones. I'm able to talk to Officer Johnson. But that takes for that officer also to not just see this person as somebody who's doing something negative or somebody who is, but what's the root behind the negative behavior that I'm seeing? So by everybody being educated on adolescence and mental health and trauma, adverse events, we now have people who are able to stand in the gaps, who are able to understand what's going on and how to deal with it. And not be afraid to talk about these things with each other, not being afraid to nobody knows everything. So learning something new or having these conversations like we're doing today, where we are engaging and talking about these experiences around mental health, whether it's for younger children, adolescents, adults, seniors, the more we talk about it, the more we engage about these things, the more benefit our community as a large can benefit from addressing mental health. One thing I wanted to address.
Well, can I ask a question?
Yes.
You've said so many things that are great. I wanted to kind of go back. I did not want to miss the part about the protective factors and risk factors.
Okay.
The way I understand what you're saying is if we can encourage the protective factors in children or adolescents, we can decrease the impact of the negative risk factors.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So if we start to really engage children around some of the protective factors, supportive things, then the other things can be eliminated. So so we think about if risk factor is unstable home, if we start to find stable housing communities for people, then there's more stability. So there's less likely that I'm going to want to hang in a negative environment when I have this environment to be in. It's less likely that I'm not going to feel like being heard, like that I'm not being heard when me and my mom have daily talks about my feelings. It decreases those risks. The violence, I'm not experiencing violence. As community violence goes down, my anxiety goes down. I'm not as anxious in the community. I'm not as anxious about certain things. So as the protective factors of community support, healthy caregivers, education, as those factors increase, then it's likely that the risk factors will decrease. And now there's more stability. Not saying that they won't ever deal with things, because there are individuals who may have really low risk factors, but still deal with some of those things. And that's to be perspective. Again, back to the social learning. So environmental factors, biological factors, but as we develop other protective factors around those things, we can kind of decrease the cycle of mental health by addressing the risk factors with the protective factors.
And you mentioned, I believe, that one of the protective factors can be churches, you know, like Sunday school.
Mm-hmm. Sunday school. Yeah, some Sunday school is a big one, but in Sunday school, there has to be an arena for adolescents, right? So when we think about, when we go to many of the churches, we see what do they call it? Church daycares, and then we see adults in their class. A lot of times the adolescent age is the age group that's kind of like, I'm too old to be in there with them babies, and I'm too young in there with the adults. And is anybody really addressing what I'm going through here, right? And so I'm unheard, unseen. So we have to really be real and address these real life experiences that are happening for adolescents with the Word of God, that we can still do that. So it's not like we say, I think sometimes churches don't know how, don't want to, don't feel comfortable to, and it's not all churches, just don't feel comfortable with addressing some of these things. But we don't need to change the Word of God, but we need to address what they're going to in the right now, right? So the Word of God hasn't changed, that stays the same. So I can address your issues with identity with the same Word of God that was there before. But if I'm not trying to address it, then it becomes an issue for you. If I'm not addressing your sexual temptation, the Word of God is still applicable for that. So I think we have to remember, how can I put the Word of God into these situations? I'm not going to change the Word of God. I'm not going to try to be so hip or do all this, but I want to address these real life experiences that these adolescents are having in this arena. And even outside of just Bible study, just having positive role models. A lot of times now at church, we go to church, we come home. We go to church, it's not real solid relationships. We lost the fellowship in a lot of churches, where churches aren't fellowshipping like they used to do, where it was, when I say fellowship, having food after service is a good time to fellowship with adolescents and talk and engage them in a way that they can feel open and supported. Having connections to community events and things that does not take away from who God is and Him receiving the glory, but also gives room for adolescents to come in, right? So I think.
So I have a question right there. So if you have an adolescent who's getting the, can you hear me?
Let me turn my sound up.
Okay. So you have an adolescent who's getting the support, the encouragement, as you said, through the church and all of that, but the parent is not on board and doesn't seem to want to participate in that part of the child's life with the church, because they're not in there.
Yeah, and that's a big thing, because, like, you know, we have some churches that do outreach, and sometimes they outreach adolescents, and it's a consistent factor. What all you can really do, the number one thing you can do is pray that God opens the eyes of that parent and reveals Himself in a way that they can get closer to Him and see Him. because if they are blind, then talking and talking and talking, it won't change anything. Prayer and fasting is what will. However, in a way that you show that that child consistency in that relationship, even though we know that they're going home and they're experiencing whatever they experience, because you're not going to always get buy-in from parents. So if I'm supposed to be watering this child, I'm just going to continue to water. If I'm weeding, then I'm going to continue to weed. If whatever I'm set to do, I'm going to do, even though it does make it more difficult when you don't have buy-in from the parent, from the supports. If you're consistent, you know, you're planting seeds, and you just pray that those seeds come forth despite the environment, despite what's going on at home. That's all you can do. It may not be today. It may be like, wow, this child who was coming to church, coming to Bible study, but they just can't get away from their environment, their family environment. But it may be a seed that you're planting. That it may not, you may just wear the planter. And then next year, somebody can come and water. So just be consistent with that child as much as you can be.
Another